Welcome to today's K-Core presentation. My name is Phil Riley. I am today's presentation host and moderator of the post-presentation Q&A session. A few words about today's presenter, John Arnason. I'm assuming that participants in this presentation have read the provide biography and presentation summary. I won't repeat that detailed information. John, an emeritus professor of biology at the University of Ottawa, undertook extensive field work and lectured on the medicinal qualities of native plants and other organisms found in tropical, subtropical, and northern environments. His talk is based on 40 years of ethnobotany, as well as lab studies of the active principles and pharmacology of medicinal plants. Now, I just want to emphasize provide a definition for ethnobotany for those people that aren't quite sure what it is. It's the study of the traditional knowledge and customs of people's experience and knowledge of plants and their medicinal religions and other uses. So with that, it's over to you, John. Have a good presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and greetings from Ottawa, where we sit on the unceded land of the Algonquin people. So I'm going to start with this advisory, and yikes, some natural product drugs will be shown as chemical drawings, and here's one here. Think of them as images of the complexity of the molecules which have evolved in nature, if you're not a scientist or chemically inclined. These are the products of millions of years of evolution with many enzymes and genes involved in each product. Currently, we're not marking any products from our research and have no conflict of interest. So here's a summary of what I'll be talking about. First, I'll introduce medicinal biodiversity, the different types of plants, fungi, bacteria, and marine organisms. They're used for medicines, and I'll look at the different categories of use: prescription drugs, formal traditional medicines, indigenous cultural medicines, and natural health products. We'll also look at what remains to be discovered using some of my own laboratory research and explorations of tropical plants, and then discuss the threats to medicinal organisms. These are similar to threats to other biodiversity. And there are some major challenges, but on a positive note, we have conservation efforts and development of ethical standards, which are having a very positive impact. Also, the interest and collaboration of Indigenous people with their renewed interest in medicinal species is very important. And I'll finish with a case study of a Maya medicinal garden in Central America. So let's start with the first category of medicinal biodiversity, and that is medicinal biodiversity that's used as drugs. And these can be botanical, fungal, bacterial, marine-derived. There are even some animal products in this category as well. And natural products from biodiversity have historically been one of our main sources of drugs. Not always the compound extracted, but quite often improved by semi-synthesis or by production of near relative compounds called analogs. Even today, in recent decades, many of the newly registered small molecule drugs are inspired by natural products or are natural products. Well, there are also another class of drugs coming from animal biotechnologies and human biotechnologies. These are large molecules like antibodies. They're not conventional natural products, but now we're finding that the combination of a natural product with an antibody may have special properties that are important. So I'm going to choose just a very few natural products from plants which have had a societal impact, just to illustrate this. So I'm starting with the tropical Yam Diascorea, which is the source of the birth control pill. And yams were traditionally used for treatment of female conditions in many cultures. They have a very large sterol content. A sterol called dioxygenin is produced in large amounts. And a very famous chemist, Marker, working at Syntex in Mexico City, developed a chemical synthesis of progesterone from dioxygenin. And actually the synthetic scheme is shown on the left here. And this made progesterone available for the birth control pill, widely available, widely accessible, and relatively cheap. So this had a huge impact on family size. Women could choose to have fewer children or no children at all. It led to the empowerment of women, and it's changed society worldwide dramatically. Here's a drug that was developed in 1993. This is Taxol. It comes from was originally isolated from the Pacific U, but it can be sourced from a variety of species of yew tree or taxus as taxanes, which then are derivatized into the anti-cancer drug. It's a breakthrough treatment for breast and ovarian cancer, and it was the first thing that really worked well after its introduction. Of course, we know today that there are side effects and toxicity issues with Taxol and other natural product anti-cancer drugs, but these are being resolved with some of the conjugates of natural products, which I'm going to show in this slide. So here we have one of the first registered antibody drug conjugates, which combines a natural product, an anti-cancer product from Metanus alexifolius, which is seen here, a South American tree. It's again another antimicrotubule agent. It's derivatized into a drug called DMI or DM1, and this is linked to an antibody. So here we have the DM1, a linker, and the antibody. Now, this antibody conjugate means that we can target the drug specifically to cancer cells, and it won't go elsewhere, causing damage and side effects. This drug has now been successfully used for metastatic breast cancer, which has relapsed after maybe 5 or 6 years of Taxol treatment. So it saves those people who otherwise might have died. Now, plants are not the only important organism. Bacterial biodiversity is yielding many important drugs with impact. And many of these are found, the bacteria that are medicinal are found in soil. Streptomyces in particular is a genus that produces a lot of medicines. One of the first one was Adriamycin, another anti-cancer drug. It was isolated from a soil sample at an Italian castle. Isn't that exotic? This is the drug, and this is what it looks like. It's bright red. It's an anti-transcription agent. Now, the polyketides from bacteria are synthesized by a gene cluster in the bacteria. And this is of considerable interest to molecular biologists because it's relatively easy to genetic engineer this gene cluster and make more of the product or new products or combined products. So we're into a whole new world of drugs with these bacterial products. Here's one that's been in the press recently. I believe Donald Trump was promoting it for COVID-19. It doesn't work for COVID-19, but it's a fantastic antiparasitic and insecticidal product. If you have a dog that you treat for heartworm, it is very effective in getting rid of the nematodes. And Merck also donated supplies for control of river blindness in Africa, and it's been pretty well wiped out by this drug. Marine natural products, I know less about them, but I know that at the meetings I go to, they're just exploding onto the scene, and there's so many of them. So I've just illustrated all kinds of different organisms are involved, from algae to tunicates to snails and so on. And these involve anti-cancer drugs, antiviral drugs, cardiovascular and analgesic drugs, and even more anti-cancer drugs. These have been registered over the course of the last 20 years or so. They're promising new research avenues. This is one that I have been involved with. Red algae, Delicia pulchra, make a furanone natural product which inhibits the ability of bacteria to form biofilms. Now, what happens is that the bacteria can signal each other. They're usually free living, but they kind of get together in colonies and clumps and films that will cover wounds. And these are very difficult to treat with antibiotics. But if you have a biofilm inhibitor like the furanone, which prevents the signaling system, they cannot form these biofilms. And we now know that algae and some plants, in fact, many plants, produce these types of bacterial biofilm inhibitors. And I see this as being a very promising area of the future. We found many in tropical plants in recent years. Okay, the second major category is traditional medicines from major civilizations. These are not the ethnobotanical drugs. These are medicines, for example, seen in traditional Chinese medicine. There are over 2,500 official monographs on single plants or fungi that are used in traditional Chinese medicine. And 40% of the products that are used in national healthcare in China are from traditional Chinese medicine. In the Indian subcontinent, you have Ayurvedic medicines, Campo medicines in Japan, and various other well-studied and well-recorded traditional medicine systems around the world. And these are not only therapeutically important to those cultures, but we have to realize they're important to the culture. People relate to these, and they're often dismissed in Western countries, but they're a very important part of people's healthcare and culture. Recently, the traditional Chinese medicines have been undergoing a kind of scientific translation where we take the traditional concepts and find out what they actually do in laboratory and clinical studies. And I participated in developing a special issue on medicinal plants and their active constituents in the treatments of metabolic syndrome, particularly type 2 diabetes. And this is the link to it. It's published in Frontiers of Pharmacology, and there are about 20 different papers there on different medicines that have been validated. Here are some of the wild and wonderful Chinese medicines. This is Kudzu Vine. It's It is used for alcohol dependence. This is Thunder God Vine. This is a very hot material for arthritis and so on. Goji Berry, many of you may have tried this. This is the Chinese superfruit with lots of antioxidants and many health-giving properties. In 2015, the Nobel Prize was awarded to UU2 for the discovery and development of an anti-malarial drug, Artemisinin, from a traditional Chinese medicine. So the plant that she studied was Artemisia annua, or quinhao, and it was used in traditional Chinese medicine for fever. She found the plant extract and its active compound, artemisinin, which is shown here, very simple compound, had potent anti-malarial activity. And artemisinin is remarkable. It's 500 times more effective than quinine, and it's effective against chloroquine-resistant malaria. It's been adopted by WHO for worldwide use against resistant malaria, a very important discovery. Okay, let's move on to the traditional ethnobotanical medicines. These are used in indigenous societies, and the World Health Organization estimates that these cultural medicines provide up to 80% of the medicines used in primary healthcare worldwide. That is, a first practitioner might use one of these medicines in treating a patient on first meeting. Now, these are different from the previous group in that they're not written down, they're orally transmitted from elders rather than written down. And there has to be an apprentice period for the individual to learn the medicines and the treatments. These are important in Africa and throughout much of Asia. And in Asia, there are many important women healers in this area. And this is my PhD student, Dana Lehman, who's now a very important medicinal plant conservation specialist at IUCN. In the Americas, traditional medicines are important for indigenous communities, and also, I would say, most Latin American rural communities. They can maintain in tropical areas several hundred species by oral tradition, even up to 1,000 if you take all the community members into consideration. And it's important to realize that this knowledge is embedded in what we call the cosmovision worldview of indigenous people in North and South America. They believe they are a part of nature, not above it, and that they affect nature and nature affects them. And in the Americas, usually the medicinal plant is a gift of the Great Spirit, and an offering of tobacco is given in return for the gift of healing. Ethnobotanists have recently transcribed previously unwritten plant uses. Most famous guy is, of course, Harvard professor Richard Evans Schultes, who wrote The Healing Forest with thousands of Amazonian plants. And this is my PhD student working at Natural Health Product Directorate now. He did the ethnobotany with the Maya healers, concentrating on plants that had anti-inflammatory activity. And this is Francisco Cal, the most important healer in the area where we worked. Here's probably the most famous Amazonian medicine, ayahuasca. It's actually a binary drug, and this shows the sophistication of the medicine. It doesn't really work without both plants being prepared together. One is the active hallucinogen. This one, Secotria, contains N,N-dimethyltryptamine, and this is the synergist containing alkaloids, which inhibit monoamine oxidase. It's now being used in experimental treatments for addiction. It apparently works quite well. But don't do this at home. You will be sick for 3 to 6 days after you take ayahuasca, so not highly recommended for self-administration. So how important, how extensive is Indigenous knowledge? Well, look at this. Daniel Moorman's comprehensive volume identifies 2,500 medicinal species of plants in North America. I did a survey years ago of Eastern Canada, and there were 400 medicinal species in Eastern Canada used with 1,700 medicinal uses. Just remarkable. The fourth category that we'll look at is the commercial herbal natural health products, as they are called in Canada, and the dietary supplements of the US. These are regulated products, which are legally sold in the marketplace under the NHP legislation in Canada and the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act in the US. The commercial value of these things is just incredible. Tyler Smith recently did a review, and the estimated value in North America is $9.6 billion worth of products, and they're increasing at a rapid rate, 8.6% over the previous years. Top sellers, CBD oil, no surprise, turmeric, elderberry, wheatgrass, et cetera, et cetera. And the top export from Canada is ginseng. That is Canadian ginseng. Okay, so that's an introduction to what medicinal biodiversity is. I haven't mentioned things like poison dart frogs or insects, but they also can be used as medicines, and snakes and so on and so forth. But I'd like to feature a case study from our own research to explore what is to be discovered. And this was a collaboration with a Costa Rican botanist, particularly Professor Luis Poveda, Pablo Sanchez, and Marco Otarola at the Universidad Nacional in Costa Rica. This is Luis Poveda, the Dean of Botany in Central America. And they collaborated with myself and Tony Durst over the last 20 years. So what was the reason for this? Well, Poveda and Sanchez said, Arnasson, find something in these tropical forests or they'll cut them all down. And I love this cartoon. There's one forestry guy saying to the other, you know what I'm saying? I just couldn't work in some stuffy little office. The outdoors just calls to me. Okay, so the focus of our project was not to get rich discovering $1 billion drugs, but actually to highlight the conservation value of rare and disappearing species, and also to find new biologically active compounds that might be useful in the future. This is the first one that Poveda and Sanchez brought to us. It was a rare, unfamiliar tree, which turned out to be a lonely tree in the only representative of its kind in a family of trees that previously were known only in Africa. And we had been looking for insecticides in tropical plants, and we tested more than 100, and this one was by far the best. You can see this leaf, the control insects had no trouble eating it up, and the extract treated one, they had absolutely no interest in it. So these compounds have an anti-feedant action. They prevent feeding by the insects. And a PhD student in our group working between Dr. Tony Durst's lab and my lab identified the active principles turned out they were new biosynthetic class of terpene, never seen before. And she found at least 17 compounds, just remarkable. They all had insecticidal activity, and there are probably many other activities yet to be discovered from these compounds. The second plant they gave us was this one, a new species from a rare family, Pleodendron costarricensis. And it was collected in a place where it seems to rain every day, above the town of Parita in western Costa Rica. And the leaves of this tree were spotless. They never had any damage on them. And usually trees have a lot of fungal or bacterial growth spots on them. So we worked with multi-drug resistant and opportunistic fungi isolated from immunocompromised patients to see if there was some antimicrobial activity. These were available in Dr. Myron Smith's lab at Carleton University. And sure enough, these are Petri plates with the pathogenic organisms growing on them. And you can see the clear zone where the extract has killed the pathogen. So we isolated some new compounds from this. These sesquiterpenes, highly antifungal and antibacterial as well. So another new discovery from these forests. Cedrela odorata is a more commonly encountered tree in Central America. It was used for fevers. From the bark, we isolated this compound, a triterpenoid called gudunin. And it was more active than chloroquine in anti-malarial tests. We found it to be a little unstable though, and so Dr. Durst's group derivatized it. He put a methoxy group on it, and we tested it out as an anti-malarial, and here you can see the new compound. This is the dose of the compound, and this is the clearance of the malaria parasite from mice. And we got a very good clearance with the derivative compound. And when we added an adjuvant, we got even better results. So there are drugs to be found in these plants. What about the ethnobotanical medicines? Well, this is another study that we did in collaboration with Cree in northern Quebec. We worked out of Medicinal and in Waskaganish, Chisasibi, and Wapmagustri up here, and other sites. Well, we were invited to work with the Cree by the Cree Health Board because they were looking for assistance on type 2 diabetes. And what had been going on in the Cree communities is that there was a transition from traditional foods and active life to refined foods and sedentary life. Does this sound familiar to any of us who are maybe having a more sedentary, refined food life? It leads to type 2 diabetes, and it exploded in Cree communities. Many of the Cree diabetic patients were also not taking their prescribed Western medicines. So the Cree Health Board said, why don't we explore some culturally acceptable alternatives? So we hypothesized that plant foods and traditional medicines might be useful. And they're still used in the community. Here are some of them. We collected about 50 altogether. We found this one in particular, Showy Mountain Ash, is one of several traditional medicines that had very strong anti-diabetic activity. And what it did was it enhanced glucose uptake in muscles. This is the same property that anti-diabetic drugs like metformin have. So this is the bioassay we used. with muscle cells. This was done by Pierre Haddad at the University of Montreal. He was the head of the project. And a postdoc in my lab fractionated the plant. And here you can see the activity of metformin in inducing glucose uptake in muscle cells. And some of these fractions that we isolated from the plant were just way more active. And eventually we got a pure compound, this one, number 2, which you can see is about 10 times more active than the conventional drug. This is the molecule right here. We also looked at tamarack, and we've isolated a compound that stimulates healthy lipid metabolism. This is a rosiglitazone drug type activity. And this is the compound that we isolated, which was quite unusual. It controls appetite, and it improves insulin sensitivity. So what happened with these plants? 5 plants were effective in diabetic animal models and safe. The Cree asked us not to do clinical trials, so we didn't. We did name the anti-obesity compound after one of the main healers in the village, so it's called awashishic acid. And rather than making drugs, what the Cree healers want to do is use these plants for public health. And currently we're working with 4 different communities to restore traditional foods and medicines, along with a traditional exercise program to reduce diabetes. And they're also encouraged to do their conventional Western therapy, but we're getting results. People are exercising more, they're eating healthier, and their diabetes in many cases is improving. So that's my experience. I would say there's lots to discover in this area, but how well has this been explored from the literature data? Well, we know that for plants, most plants are described, but only about 6% have been investigated pharmacologically, only about 15% phytochemically. Fungal and marine species, we don't know what half of them are, and they're still in a very active discovery phase. The bacterial species is a complete black box. There are 4,000 bacterial species in 1 gram of forest soil. How many different forests are there in the world? And we haven't thought about extreme or exotic environments. There must be a huge number of interesting natural products among these sources. So there's also potential for new targets through advances in biotechnology, and evolution is frankly the best chemist produces some of the most interesting things available. I'd like you to bear in mind that diversity, whether it's plants, animals, marine organisms, is mostly tropical. In fact, for plants, 68% are tropical. So the question I would ask now is, will we lose the majority of medicinal organisms before they're ever studied? So what are the threats and issues with medicinal biodiversity? Well, I'm not a full-time conservationist, but I'm well aware of the issues, and I just thought I'd go over them with you. Habitat loss, over-harvesting, climate change, invasive species, disputes over ownership, and so on. So habitat loss, this is the classic deforestation of Costa Rica. This is a map of Costa Rica in 1940. 67% was covered with forest. By 1983, it was almost all deforested. And if you know the country, you can be sure that these are all the national parks in Costa Rica, or inaccessible, very wet mountain areas. In Amazonia, of course, the dangerous thing is logging, which goes in. And the logging itself doesn't do that much, but it creates entrance roads, and then ranchers and farmers come in and they deforest the area, and that's leads to fragmentation of the area. So this is the sad area of tropical forest, which as decades go on just gets lower and lower. And deforestation by country, well, in Africa, it's pretty well complete in 26 countries. In Asia, it's complete in Philippines, Pakistan, Latin America, several countries. And then here are the top deforesting countries in the tropics. So the consequences of habitat loss for medicinal species, well, we hear from the elders. Francisco Cal in Belize reports the scarcity of medicinal plants near the Maya villages. He has to walk miles or get driven into forests which are 100 kilometers away. In Togo, where we worked, the healers there reported that their forests had been extirpated and prized medicinal plants were effectively extinct in the wild now. E.O. Wilson, in his groundbreaking book, The Future of Life, pointed out that there is a relation between the number of species that can live and the size of its habitat. So if we think of forest fragments, the number of species is dependent on the area that they live in. So even if we don't cut down the last tree of a species, they'll undergo a genetic bottleneck and wink out eventually. So large number of species cannot survive in small patches of natural habitat. But extinction is slow, and we expect it to reach about 50% of species by the end of the century due to habitat reduction. Commercial trade, lots of examples of overharvesting, especially before year 2000. Things like devil's claw used for arthritis in Europe, aloe used in skin treatments, pygeum used in Europe for prostate, frankincense used in many products and a bunch of other plants. Local extirpation of these occurred in many areas where contracts were offered to collect the plants. Global warming is the other problem. Endemic species that only grow in one specific area are at particular risk. So the one that I wanted to feature was the Fynbos region of South Africa. This is a natural shrubland with an isolated Mediterranean climate, and it has many, many endemic shrubs and plants, very interesting, unusual, unstudied plants. Now, what's going to happen as global climate change occurs? Well, in the southern hemisphere, this climate envelope, the Mediterranean climate, is going to walk off into the Indian Ocean, and obviously these guys can't go there, so they'll go extinct. High altitude endemic species are also threatened, and that's because with climate change, there'll be a migration of biozones upwards, and the guys at the top will be thrown off into outer space and have nowhere to go. So where are the threatened endemics? This is data from Norman Myers. No surprise, tropical areas of the world are where most of these endemics are. Okay, and just to give you something which is a little bit more relatable, this is some of the amphibians, the golden toad and harlequin frog from Monteverde, Costa Rica. They haven't been seen since the late 1980s. Why? Well, disappearance of these amphibians likely due to decline in mist frequency. They do require water for reproduction and this is ascribed to global warming, and this is a very important group that is disappearing rapidly. Many of the frogs also contain interesting and fascinating natural products. In our area, the boreal forest is one of the most threatened biomes. And there are many reasons for this, but in British Columbia, we saw the mountain pine beetle, actually a native species of insect, but warming winters have reduced the winter kill of the beetle. And this is an unusual beetle because it's cooperative and it mounts an attack on trees together. And these are not always successful, but if you've got more beetles, you get more successful attacks. So in 2004, there was an article in the paper saying that beetles could chew up the interior of British Columbia by 2020. Well, guess what? It happened. They're all gone now. There are no pine trees left in the interior of British Columbia anymore. Likewise, global warming has had serious effects during El Nino events. In Australia, we get bleaching of coral reefs. And what happens here is that the coral animal has a symbiotic algae. And when it gets too hot, the algae says, I'm out of here, it's too hot. And it just leaves and the coral starves. Now, with boreal forest or with tropical reefs, once the habitat dies, all the other things, all the tunicates, the algae, snails, and so on that are found in this habitat are lost with it. Invasive species are another problem. Again, talking about reefs, crown of thorns is destroying the Great Barrier Reef. It is not a non-native, it's actually a native, but what's happened is that the population has increased due to overfishing of the predators of the starfish and also to sedimentation of agricultural sediments on the reef. And so these guys are destroying vast areas of the reef, although I understand the Australians have managed to get it under control a bit. In North America, we now have invasive European hogs, and they're around worldwide. They've been a problem in the US for a while, but now they're in Alberta and Ontario. And they're going after our endemic root crops, things like golden seal, wild leeks, and ginseng. And IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, has done an assessment, and you can see their effect worldwide on plants, affecting over 300 species of plants is quite startling. So what can be done about this? Well, we have attempts at regulation by governments. So the Convention on Biodiversity, the CBD, is worth talking about, signed at the Rio Conference, chaired by Canadian Maurice Strong in 1992, and it affirms the right of developing countries to control biodiversity, but they were supposed to provide access to pharmaceutical companies and developed countries in exchange for conserving the biodiversity. So that was the benefit sharing aspect. The US didn't sign, and the governments really didn't think about their Indigenous people. So almost right away, what happened was that Pfizer, the same guys who brought you the vaccines, signed an agreement with the government of South Africa to harvest hoodia, a succulent plant, not a cactus, which was used by the San Indigenous people for hunger control, and they developed an anti-appetite drug. But they hadn't bothered to talk to the San people, and this caused a major controversy worldwide. And Pfizer eventually said, oh, to heck with it. We're not going to bother with this project. We thought we got the permits and it didn't work. So Canada, ever the Boy Scout nation, decided to revise the CBD with the Nagoya Protocol. And it provided a framework for, it was forward-looking and in looking for a framework for sharing benefits with Indigenous people. Unfortunately, Canada did not consult with the Canadian First Nations until about 2 weeks before the international meeting. I was at that consultation meeting, and I can tell you there were dozens of First Nations there, and they were extremely annoyed. In fact, the protocol has been rejected by a consortium of First Nations as both a colonial process and a document that violates their sovereignty and treaty rights. So there are more efforts by the CBD. Now there's a debate over bacterial gene sequences. This is the digital sequence information. In the spring, there was a meeting of developing countries with developed country geneticists. And the developing country said, well, you shouldn't be allowed to post these gene sequences until you've paid us for these organisms. And the developed world scientists objected that this proposal will effectively stop research in molecular biology and evolution. The developing nations have now threatened to stop any conservation efforts in retaliation. Just this month, we had another conservation of biodiversity on the High Seas Conference. No consensus at this meeting, and the sticking points again were benefit sharing and selection of conservation areas. Okay, so the legacy of the CBD biopiracy was stopped in the global south. But the pharmaceutical industry and developed country benefit sharing, it hasn't materialized in any substantive ways. There are no drug discovery projects in developing countries today. It's just a dead zone. Consequently, conservation, because they're not getting the money, the global south has decided not to bother with it. So the Yasuni National Park, the most biodiverse spot on the planet, Ecuador has released oil leases in this area. Academic research and international collaboration is much weaker, and especially in the Amazon due to the arduous biodiversity laws. However, Indigenous people have benefited. They've become aware of their value of their traditions. I would say the conservation community has been more successful, and they've suggested things that are practical and appear to be working. So Norman Myers suggested that we should identify hotspots for conservation where endemics are frequent and habitat loss is high. So think about Central America, lots of people, lots of endemic species, forests are threatened there. This is a good place to have parks and conservation areas. So international organizations are buying up land for conservation, and this is something that seems to be working. Also, conservation organizations have suggested a problem to the fragmentation is to link areas of forest with corridors. And they have done this in a number of areas with a hope to increase diversity and prevent eventual extinction because the area for many species is too small. So there are many non-governmental organizations. I would say the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, is one of the most important, along with Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, American Botanical Council and USC Canada. These are some of the organizations. IUCN has developed the Red Book, rating the status of species with their so-called SARA listing, you know, anything from least concern to extinct with threatened, and 3 categories of endangered in the middle. And of 200 or 26,000 medicinal species that they recognize in the plant world, approximately 9% are considered threatened with extinction based on the red list. So that's quite a large number. 400 are endangered and several are extinct. And here's one that went extinct. It was a Roman plant that was used as an aphrodisiac. So I wonder why it was overused. I guess it was the original Viagra. Okay, so IUCN has spearheaded conservation efforts, and their inputs led to the CITES Treaty, which prevents importation of endangered species by signatory countries. And this has been a very successful program. One of the problems we have with medicinal species is that only about 3 to 6% are actually cultivated. So another approach is to use eco-labeling. So you can provide certificates of sustainable harvest. And this is done by organizations like Fair Wild, Rainforest Alliance, and so on. These are successful measures, and you can read about it in some of these literature references. The latest report is the Wild Check report, and it looks at the global trade and some of the problems. I won't go into it, it's just a repeat, but the detailed recommendations really emphasize behavior change in consumers. Consumers need to look and make sure that their products are sustainably harvested. Traders and decision makers need to make sure that people are not being exploited in gathering these things and that they're being gathered sustainably. So that's the focus of modern conservation efforts. And just to bring it home, here's one of my favorite endangered species, mahogany. Who would have thought? One of the most widely used timber species. It's a source of timber. We found some great insecticides in it. It's also used for medicines, and it's now endangered as well. So what else can you do? Well, Lowasser and colleagues thought you could grow them, and they looked at which species are being grown or preserved and collected in gene banks and botanical gardens. They did a very exhaustive search, and they came up with 72,000 species, which is quite a bit higher than IUCN's list, I might add. And what they found was that most collections in these botanical gardens and so on were actually the cultivated species, which really aren't that much at risk. There are very few of the wild species. And for at least 1,000 species, there's no sample anywhere in any collection. And so these are at highest risk of extinction. All right, so one of the suggestions that came from IUCN was proposed by the former chief scientist, and he argued that indigenous cultures, preservation of indigenous cultures and biological diversity go together. Indigenous cultures are the natural stewards of tropical forests. So what we should be doing is encouraging them, giving them opportunities to protect tropical forest and save biodiversity. And so as an example of this, I'll talk briefly about our botanical garden in Belize, the Itzama Garden. Now, this was a project that was started as a collaboration with the University of Ottawa, Cleveland State University, and Maya healers that we were working with. It was the idea of the Maya healers, and they acquired from the Belize government about 20 hectares of disturbed secondary rainforest and shrubland. And what they did was they developed a botanical garden for wild medicinal species that were disappearing around the Maya villages of Central America. Here are some of the cultivated ones that were cultivated in an open forest patch, but many of them were plants that they had to travel many miles to find in pristine places like the remote Maya Mountains. And these were brought back and they were planted under the canopy of a secondary forest. The healers started this garden to preserve medicinal plants, which are disappearing with deforestation, and it also provides a source near to their patients. Most of the transplantations didn't work on the first try, but the healers figured out what they had to do, and they were eventually able to get about 150 species into cultivation. We've mapped their garden, and this open field area, grassland, had the cultivated species. The late succession forest had wild species grown underneath it. This is the plan of some of the cultivated species. And this is a very interesting thing that the healers came up with. Using giant logs of felled trees, they put epiphyte species, things like orchids and begonias that normally grow high in trees, on these logs, and cultivated many species along the log. So a successful project. So in conclusion, medicinal biodiversity remains a major source of new drugs. And for our future, they can be more targeted and safer as we learn more from the Human Genome Project and get better pharmacological targets. Medicinal biodiversity has a surprisingly large cultural, commercial, and health value in both developed and less developed countries. And the tools to conserve medicinal biodiversity are known and have been used successfully in many pilot projects world by conservation agencies. Treaty efforts at protection have had variable results and success, but management by local and indigenous groups have been quite successful. The prospects for terrestrial biodiversity are not that great. We're probably going to lose another 120 million hectares of wild lands converted to agriculture. In these countries, large blocks of untouched forest in the Amazon Congo will likely be broken up, and forest will remain only in reserves, parks, and mountainous areas. Medicinal plants will remain where cultivated or protected by local people. Major extinctions are expected by the turn of the century, but we don't think this will lead to ecological collapse if things don't get too severe. Ecosystems have adapted to climate change many times in the past, but species loss is inevitable. Similarly, for reefs, we're seeing a serious decline, close to 60% may be lost in a few years. Although extinction and reef loss is expected, resilience is expected in some species, and migration north is also expected. A major management recommendation that would help the reefs is that 30% of them should be no-take areas for fishing and other uses. So In conclusion, in the spirit of Donald Rumsfeld, we know we will lose some medicinal species in the future, but we know many species will be protected. Unfortunately, we know that there are many unknowns, that is, unknown species with unknown value that we will never know. So I'll leave the last word to Gary Larson. Think about it, Ed. The class Insecta contains 26 orders, almost 1,000 families, over 750,000 described species, but I can't shake the feeling that we're all just a bunch of bugs. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, John. I'm going to start off with a question, and then I have 5 other people that want to query you on some aspect of your presentation. Peter McKinnon is going to follow me. So, as you know, my background is in plant physiology and ecology, and the information that you've provided in relation to Canada leads to the question of which medicinal plants of Canada and North America should we be concerned about?
Well, the short answer to that is that there's a very interesting article written by Susan Murch in the February issue of Botany, and it describes medicinal plant conservation and those species that are at risk very concisely. But the ones that I think are most at risk are ginseng, which is, I would say, effectively extinct in the wild now. There are a few minor populations, but we studied ginseng 10 or 15 years ago, and we went out to look at so-called wild populations in our area, and every time we got there, we discovered that they were all gone, and all there was a patch of torn up soil where somebody had taken all the ginseng out. Other ones that are endangered are wild leek, especially in Quebec. It's a very popular product. It is protected. Bloodroot, black cohosh, particularly through its eastern North American range in the US. Mayapple in southern Ontario. In Western Canada, there are a number of species of concern. Devil's Club, which is a very popular plant at this moment. Seneca snakeroot on the prairies, and so on. These are all plants that are seeing some pressure. Often what happens is that you have trends, there are trendy plants. So we just came through a pandemic. So what do you think? Any plant that's antiviral suddenly became popular, and it was bought and collected and extirpated. And elderberry is one of them. Echinacea is another, and a number of other species.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And so Peter McKinnon, and then that will lead to Art Hunter after Peter.
Thank you, Phil. John, thank you very much for a very interesting, rather complex, technically, presentation. And I have a question that I guess is a little historical, and I'm wondering if you can comment on it. And I'll just read what I put in the chat. How did we diverge in the past from traditional natural medicinal substances to creating synthetic drugs without having exploited the former, especially in the Western world?
Well, it happened in, the short answer to that is the Food and Drug Act, which was enacted about 1928 in the US and Canada. They basically banned the use of crude drugs or medicinal plant extracts as prescription medicines in favor of purified drugs. And there were two reasons for that. The so-called scientific justification was that purified drugs were easier to dosify, to get the correct dose. There was less problem with contamination or quality control with pure substances. The other answer is that the pharmaceutical industry found it very convenient to get this law passed because they patented them, and any patented registered drug is worth at least $100 million. Mm-hmm. And as much, something like Taxol, $2 billion. So the commercial motivation is very clear. And medicinal plants are much less valuable.
Okay, thank you very much. I just had an additional comment on this, and then I'll pass it on. I had a few other questions, but I'll pass it on after this comment. I do agree with you about the Chinese in regard to looking into the traditional chemistry, if you like, of their traditional medications. In fact, I've been retained recently by our embassy in Beijing to analyze the latest science and technology 5-year plans. And there is, in fact, a whole theme in the National Science Plan that deals with trying to get a better understanding of the biochemistry of their traditional medications.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of research going on in the Chinese scientific community with their traditional medicinal plants. And basically, they're not trying to support the old indications for use. They're translating them into modern clinical terms. Yes, that's what they're doing.
Yep, exactly. Thank you very much. Back to you, Bill.
Okay, so Art, and then Bill Pugsley after Art.
Okay, I was listening to this and remembering, of course, trips in the woods and what happens now when certain plant species get on your skin and what have you, which leads to the question of the ingestion, how these particular medications get injected into the body, and I guess ultimately into the bloodstream, whether it's, you know, orally using either a pill form or perhaps mixed with food, or as a tea. And I guess there's even some drugs which people ingest into their body through their nostrils, and of course there's you can put it right on the skin itself for whatever the local treatment is. And it struck me that potentially you might be able to take, or are there any drugs that you've studied, natural drugs that are in fact used in multiple ways? They're not all used the same way, and perhaps for potentially different outcomes.
Yes, there are things that have multiple activities, particularly plant-derived drugs, and they're known as panaceas. Ginseng is one obvious one. It has many different properties. It's a good anti-diabetic drug. We did some work with colleagues at U of T. It lowers glucose in human clinical trials, but it's also an anti-tumor drug. And it has effects on blood pressure. It has quite a number of different properties. This can be good or bad depending on your point of view, but it means that there has to be a good scientific basis of understanding of some of these plants before using them. Just another quick comment on, you know, absorption of these things. Many of these compounds are defense compounds of the plants. And what they are trying to do is produce pharmacological agents that will be absorbed quickly. Small molecules go into the body of insects or of herbivores that are eating them and disrupt them. They don't necessarily want to kill them off, because if you kill off the vast majority of organisms, you end up with a resistant population. So all they want to do is slow you down. And through evolution, they have to choose a different target each time, because there's always an adapted insect to an old target. And that's why we have such a diversity of medicinal compounds. It's an evolutionary trait, and these things are designed in evolution to go to different receptors and targets.
I just want to say, what a fascinating subject. I'm sure that from your presentation, there's a vast amount of discovery yet to be made. And I certainly get a sense of some urgency that you can get on with it before these plants go extinct. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, Bill Pugsley, it's your turn, and then Peter McKinnon has another question.
Okay, thanks very much, Phil. And thank you, John, for your, as Art said, encyclopedic overview of the subject. My question has to do with any link between medicinal plants and the research going on in that and combating COVID-19 or HIV and other viral diseases. You mentioned that it has been used for diabetic type 2 controls or challenges, as well as cancer, breast cancer. And my question comes from the point of view of deforestation, bringing humans into contact with some animals that seem to bring the virus, a new virus, to the humans, as occurred apparently in China. And given the interest in China in medicinal plant research, I just wondered, is there a connection there?
Yeah, so if I understand what you mean, are there antiviral plants that are being worked on? And the answer is definitely yes. There are lots of them. But I would say there's sort of a second line defense. You know, you're much better off with a vaccine than you are with an antiviral drug. And there are a number of reasons for that. The trouble with viruses is that, you know, they produce millions, if not billions of copies, and they can adapt very quickly. You know, they do work for a while, but then they adapt to the drug quite quickly. The other issue is that if you are vaccinated, you tend to have an upfront immunity, whereas with an antiviral, you're treating it afterwards. Now, we do have antiviral pharmaceuticals like Tamiflu. They don't work very well either. Fortunately, I believe there is one Moderna antiviral for COVID, which is pretty good for people who've had a bad reaction to the vaccine. But my advice is go for the vaccination. If you get sick, I just got sick I had some visitors from Yellowknife, and they brought the gift of COVID to our house, and I just recovered last week. I used echinacea. Seemed to help. It's a good, well-known antiviral. It's something that we've worked with, and in laboratory studies, it's quite good. Clinically, the antivirals, not hugely effective, but they can help.
Okay, so Peter McKinnon, and then That'll be the last request for comments, but I have one final one that I'll pose. So Peter?
Okay, thanks, Phil. Yes, John, just a simple question, and just wondering if Kew Gardens in London plays any role in supplying plants and does research in this area that you.
Oh yes, they're a major contributor, and they're more of a sort of a plant collection organization, but they are greatly interested in any applications of these wild species for conservation purposes. They have something, they curate what's known as the plant list. And the plant list is the most up-to-date version of the taxonomy of plants with all the revisions that have come from different studies. And anytime we publish something, we go on the Kew site to the plant list, and we make sure that the name of the plants that we're using is up to date and approved by their taxonomists. They have huge collections also of these things, so they're very important for cultivation of wild and exotic species that are often medicinal.
Did they supply these plants on a pro bono basis, some form of exchange with scientists around the world?
I believe they do. I think you have to go through a permit process, though. It takes a while to get something, and it depends on how much of it they have and what they're willing to give away. I think they'd probably be quite willing to give away seed, but maybe not so interested in giving cuttings or whole plants.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you everybody for your questions. As you were talking, John, something came back to my memory, and it goes back to 1972, when I was assigned to accompany the Berger inquiry on their Mackenzie Valley pipeline inquiry. And we went to Indigenous communities up in the north, and the question was, what do you think about having a pipeline coming down the Mackenzie River? And in that inquiry, there was almost a holus bolus of the only thing that mattered was, don't cut off the transportation corridors for the animals that we hunt, don't pollute our waters, don't do things that interfere with our lifestyle, the Indigenous lifestyle. And then 10 years later, there was a review of the decision to temporarily halt the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline project. And they went back to the Indigenous communities, and to their surprise, the answer was, we're now employees of the pipeline industry, whether it be the transportation aspect or the installation aspect or providing food, all of the different services that the pipeline industry requires. And the answer was, no, go ahead and build the pipeline. We're not dependent on a healthy ecosystem anymore. With your experience with the Indigenous community in relation to ethnobotany, do you see any likelihood of, while we are currently very interested in helping them reestablish their raison d'etre for living on the land that they occupy, that they may sort of say, no, we're just going to become part of that society which is failing?
Yeah, well, Phil, I know what you're saying, but people are people, and they're you have to give them the choice. I guess what's happened is that the steady jobs and employment is very attractive to many people. I think if you went back and talked to the elders, there'd still be many people, and many young people also, who are interested in preserving the ecology of the area, and so on. This is the same issue that I saw in northern Quebec with the development of the hydroelectric James Bay project and so on, and it had really helped out the community a lot. I had been in Medicinal and some of those northern Quebec communities in the early 1980s, late 1970s, and living conditions were pretty desperate. You know, people lived in small cabins or cloth tents. And coming back now, they've got suburban houses which are being built. So it's pretty hard not to not to be tempted by these things. But some of the elders were saying, well, you know, downstream of LG2, the big power dam, all the medicinal plants in that area appear to be dying, particularly the Labrador tea. And we had a look at it, part of the project, not myself personally, but Alain Courrier, our botanist. And what appeared to be happening was that the fall of the water out of the dam creates mist, which led to fungal infections on the Labrador tea, killing it off. And quite a wide stretch of the area was affected by the dam. There still is concern in these communities for the ecology, but the temptations of modern life are also there. I don't think it's for us to judge. It's just for us to encourage best practices as well as we can.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So as host, and there are no more questions, I'm going to pass the operation back to Jean and Dave Doherty.
Thank you, Phil. And John, I have the privilege and the pleasure to thank you for this absolutely fabulous presentation on behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. What you've illustrated has just been a phenomenal amount of information that's pretty hard to digest, but it's also highlighting how desperately we need to conserve the biodiversity of the planet, not just because it's important for us, but it's important for the health of the whole planet. And I think that what you've done today has just been a wonderful presentation, and I thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you very much, and that was the message that I wanted to get across.
Well, you succeeded. Thank you. And for those of you who are left, I would like to say, please check our CanadianCore.com website for information about all of the activities of our particular organization, as well as if you go on to the Stay Informed section and log in for that, you will get the information about this particular talk and upcoming talks. And you can log in and get the information and be able to see this particular presentation again, and also look at any of the other presentations that we've had. And if you have the opportunity to go on the YouTube and look at this particular presentation or any of the others, please subscribe to our website and you'll get more information as we go along. Anyway, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming.